Your world, your challenges, your faith. When faith within engages the world without, there's power. It's living life from the inside out.
The pandemic has taken a toll on pastors. By the end of 2021, significantly more pastors were thinking about leaving full-time ministry than had at the beginning of that same year. So, what is weighing down pastors? And is there anything the people in the pews can do to help? We're talking about that today on Family Life's Inside Out. I'm Martha Manikas Foster, and my guest is Joe Jensen. He's Vice President of Church Engagement for the Barna Group, which has been researching faith in America for 3 decades. Welcome, Joe, to Inside Out.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You know, I've been reading some of your studies, and I've been observing with my own eyes, pastors are burning out or they're on their way. According to your numbers, by the end of 2021, 38% of pastors were considering leaving full-time ministry. That was up from 29% at the beginning of that same year. Where's that at today, and what's behind the increase? What are the stresses pastors are feeling?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as a former pastor myself, I've been tracking this data not just as a Barna employee, but as a pastor and really keeping in touch with, close friends and former colleagues. And that 38%, when you see that big of a jump from 29% to 38%, and recently we saw that number inch up a little bit higher to 42%, which 38 to 42% is still within kind of a margin of error. So it's basically the same, slight increase. But the point is, last year, January, we asked that question, it was 29%, and then a little over a year later, it's up to 42%. Right. So that is a significant increase. And, you can look at a lot of factors. The obvious one is the pandemic. That took a toll on all of us, no matter what profession you're in. We're seeing, the great resignation type of trends where over half of Americans, according to Gallup and other sources, are telling us that, over half of us in the U.S. population are reconsidering our jobs. We're looking for new jobs. We're considering new callings. And so it's no surprise that pastors, the profession of the pastor, was not immune from that. But when you look underneath the surface, your question about why is a great one. And we've been tracking that as well at Barna, trying to figure out what's underneath the surface. Why are pastors considering departing from their profession as a pastor? And so, we asked some questions in a recent study that we just did in March of this year to try to give us a fuller picture of why pastors are considering leaving. There's many responses, right? But I want to highlight the top 3.
Okay, yeah. When
we ask that question, why, to those who check the box, yes, I'm considering leaving full-time ministry, and we asked them why, and we gave them a list of choices, many of them. Their top 3 responses, the number one at 56% said the immense stress of the job. Their second response at 43%, they said they feel lonely and isolated. And then third at 38%, they cited current political divisions. So when you look at those, and again, there's a lot more, the immense stress of the job, feeling lonely and isolated, and then navigating current political divisions within their church and their community were the top 3 reasons they gave for why they were considering quitting full-time ministry.
Now, full-time ministry has always had stress. Can we understand that the feelings of isolation and loneliness and the political divisions are making it even more stressful than it used to be a pastor?
Yeah. We can't draw direct correlations too much within the data, but I think we can use some common sense and some anecdotal evidence and just kind of be able to put the picture together. And like you said, I was a pastor for over 20 years. There's always been stress with that job. I mean, to shepherd people through all the messiness and ups and downs of life, leading them closer to Jesus, like that's an intense job. That's a stressful calling at times. And so, there's always been stresses, but I don't think there's ever been a time, at least in modern history, where we have been able to see the convergence of so many stressors at one time. So the pandemic had such a dynamic impact on every institution in culture and society, and the church was not exempt from that, right? And I think we've been talking to a lot of pastors who've told us that we had problems before the pandemic, but the pandemic seemed to elevate those problems that were already there. And then you throw in the political divisions, of 2020 and beyond, and the impact of technology on all generations, but especially the younger generations of leaders, right? So, in other research, we found that young people are more connected but more lonely than ever. Because they feel connected because of technology and social media, but they feel isolated as well.
Right.
And so everything that came with the pandemic, as far as being isolated and being quarantined and having to now work more remotely in some contexts, and then the impact of technology and social media, I think all of those things combined, I think your question is an insightful one, because it's not just one thing, and we can't compartmentalize or segment the stressors. They all impact one another, and they all feed into one another.
Let me take just a moment to reset for those who are listening. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Inside Out on Family Life. I'm talking today with Joe Jensen, Vice President of Church Engagement for the Barna Group. Joe, you've pointed this out already. There's lots of tension in the country, enmity maybe even, and it seems to be pandemic and politics. So interwoven, those two ideas. Churches haven't escaped the divisions, even with these continued tensions, because they're not going away right away. Have you found ways that pastors might contribute to their own well-being short of leaving the pastorate?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think what you're getting at is the internal life of a leader and the impact that the internal life of a leader has on the external ministry that they do day to day. So well-being is something that we're paying attention to and really tracking. In some recent, research we did on pastors, we found that those who were thinking about leaving full-time ministry, their relational, their emotional, their mental health scores were significantly lower, 10, 15, 20% lower than those who were not considering leaving full-time ministry. And so you can kind of draw some correlating insights there to say that, across the board, well-being is a factor, especially for those pastors who are considering leaving. And so, we encourage pastors all the time. I've been saying that we need to foster environments and create cultures. And I would say, I'm speaking to congregants too right now, to say, is it really okay for your pastor to not be okay? Right? Do you have a safe space? Do you have a safe environment in your church where your pastor can actually be real? Can actually be open and say, you know what, I'm not perfect. I don't have my life together. I do have anxious thoughts. I am worried about the future, because the pastorate can be a very lonely place. And part of that idea of feeling lonely and isolated, 43%, that stat I referenced earlier.
Yes.
That there's a lot of factors to that, right? Pastors aren't just feeling lonely and isolated because they're holed up in their house.
Right.
And they're separated physically from people. I mean, sometimes that's the case. But a lot of times they feel lonely and isolated emotionally, right? Mentally, because it's a very difficult position. The very people that you're in contact with the most are sometimes the people that you have to have the more strictest boundaries, just because of the nature of the pastorate, right? Like you can't, at least you don't feel like as a pastor you can just pour your heart and soul out to a congregant.
Right. No, it seems like more often than in most other professions or most other callings, you're not with peers, right? As a pastor, you're always a leader in some sense, I guess. Yeah.
And so I would just add to that too, like knowing that profession of a pastor can be very lonely and very isolating. You have to be proactive to seek out deeper connections. And where I always tell people to start is the church across the street or the church down the street. Because here's the thing, when you can connect with other pastors, they understand where you're at because they're in that same position. They understand the stresses of the job, the pressures of the position, and they're typically safe places. I mean, you got to be discerning about who you share with, but I always say, within your community, whether you're in a rural community or an urban community, there's churches everywhere. And so reach across denominational lines, reach across geographic lines, go across a street, go across town, and get a network. Even if you live in a small town, get a network of pastors, meet on a regular basis, ask each other the tough questions, be vulnerable. And that's a great place to start, because I know on Sunday mornings you can't just pour your heart and soul out from the pulpit or with your congregants. So start there.
That's great wisdom. Thank you. So you've somewhat addressed the people in the pews. We value our pastors. Do you have suggestions for how we might help relieve the stress on them? And I'm wondering if in part of it might be like embodied connection. If isolation is one of the issues for a pastor, maybe it's actually being with the pastor and the pastor's family. But you have the data. What are ways that we in the congregations can help relieve the stress on our pastors?
I think there's just some really easy practical things, right? Like being proactive. Like, don't wait for your pastor to come ask you. Okay, be proactive and go ask your pastor. And it can be simple things like, hey, is there anything I can do around the church to help? Right? And it can be little things, right? And you can be specific. If you ask too general of a question, like, hey, what can I do to help? They may not have an answer. So have eyes to see and ears to hear, like, the needs of the church and the community, and ways that you can step up and help. And they can be small things. Like if you're in a small church and, you know, there might be just simple things like helping out, cleaning up after an event. Sometimes the pastor's the last person there, stacking up chairs and putting things away and cleaning up. So it's just sticking around. You know, a pastor friend of mine, his name's Jay Kim, he always talks about like the importance of lingering spaces. So I think lingering spaces are great, and we need those in our churches. And I think actually when you linger and hang around, it gives you a great chance to connect with your pastor and your church leaders. And it gives you a great way to serve. You just open your eyes and pitch in, see ways that you can serve, and then proactively go and offer your help. That's on a very practical level. And then I would say just on a deeper level, I would just let your church leader know through a written note, maybe, you know, hang around after the service and tell him or her this in person, but just simply say, hey, like, I want you to know that if you're going through anything, I want you to know I'm praying for you. I want you to know that it's okay to not be okay. Right? To just be able to verbally, like, hear that from your congregation, I think is really important. To say, hey, you know what? Like, I just want you to know that this is a safe space, that we're not going to judge you. That you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have your life all together. We just want you to be real and honest. And we want you to know that this is a community for you as well. Like, you're not just here to serve us. We're here to serve you. And I think just those simple words, whether it's just through a handwritten note or through a quick verbal affirmation, I think that can speak volumes to the pastor and leader that you are in community with. So.
And it's simple, but it is profound to be able to say, Pastor, this is your place too. That must have at least the potential for relieving a great deal of pressure. Yeah. Just real quick, I would like to share just a couple of stats that maybe fill that out a little bit.
Great. When we asked pastors that question earlier that I referenced, like, why are you considering leaving full-time ministry? 21% said, I don't feel respected by congregants. 1 out of 10 said, I don't have what I need to be successful in my job. Another 12% said, I don't feel supported by my staff. So there's kind of a trend there, even though that's not a huge number compared to, 40, 50%. That represents thousands of pastors across the country who are feeling maybe like they're not supported. Maybe they don't have all the resources they need to be successful in their position. And I would say whether it's congregants stepping up or staff stepping up to support each other, if you're on a mid-size or larger church staff, realizing that pastors, again, it's contributing to your point earlier about feeling lonely and isolated, feeling like, do they have the respect? Do they have the support of those around them? I think is really important.
And Joe, as you mentioned earlier, the trend line isn't going down, right?
Right.
So this is very important, not to say in the rearview mirror we ought to have done. It's something that is a vital concern immediately, right now, in the moment.
Yes. Yeah. And I would say, like, to that point, the trend is going upward in a not the direction we want upward to go, right?
Yeah, right.
But here's the thing. When we just get practical and we do the simple things over time, I always say it's not just enough to do the right things. You have to do the right things consistently over time. And that's where trends actually start to reverse themselves, start to change, go into the different direction, is with consistency over time. And so these simple things, like I'm telling you, I've just been there when I've gotten consistent feedback and encouragement over time. That's when things start to form in a different way, right? But when it's just momentary, like Pastors Appreciation Month in October, that's great. But Pastors Appreciation Month needs to be it can't just be a month.
Right.
It needs to be this continual thing where we're appreciating our pastors, encouraging our pastors consistently over a long period of time. That's how we're going to reverse these trends. Mm-hmm. And so I'd encourage congregants, elders, deacons, whoever it is that's surrounding pastors at this moment, be consistent, persevere, push through, and let's help our pastors turn some of these trends around. I think we can do it.
Oh, that's an encouragement. Thank you. And thank you so much, Joe, for joining me here today on Inside Out.
Oh, you're welcome. It was good to be here.
My guest has been Joe Jensen, Vice President of Church Engagement for the Barna Group. You'll find information on this and other Barna Group research by going to barna.com. I'm Martha Manikas Foster with Inside Out on Family Life.